Your company's future success demands agile, flexible, and resilient operations. I'm your host, Daphne Luchtenberg, and you're listening to McKinsey Talks Operations, a podcast where the world's C-suite leaders and McKinsey experts cut through the noise and uncover how to create a new operational reality. The transition from one year to the next is often a moment to pause and reflect on the year gone by, as well as put in place plans 12 months ahead. For today's episode of McKinsey Talks Operations, I'm delighted to be joined by Swan and Ruth Heuss, global co-conveners of our operations practice, to do just that. We'll examine the key operations topics for 2024 and think about how they will evolve in the coming year. Will Gen AI still be the talk of the town? And how will the approach to productivity differ on both sides of the Atlantic? Ruth and Dan, it's great to have you both here today. Welcome.
Terrific. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, excited to be here. I think operations will be at the core of many people's minds, has already been in 24 and will for sure be in 25.
So, Dan, if we look back for a moment, what were the key things that were keeping our clients awake in 2024?
I think it's hard to say that 2024 was anything other than an interesting year. I would probably say three things that I've seen people really wrestling with consistently. The first is it does feel like there's a lot of uncertainty in the world today. And whether that's macro uncertainties like geopolitics and tariff and trade, et cetera, or there's some more, what's the economy going to look like? What is job growth going to look like? What is consumer spending going to look like? I think there's been a lot of things that make it hard for people to really plan their business, plan their operations, and know exactly what moves they should make or even what moves they should consider. The second theme is around productivity. Look, productivity is always important. Been doing operations work a very long time. I probably could have said productivity every year if you asked me this question every year. But I do think the productivity imperative had a heightened emphasis this year, both because of the uncertainty that I've already talked to, but also we're just on the back of what everybody knows was once in a generation inflation. And when you say, hey, inflation has come down this year to more like 3%, or depending on where you are in the world, that's still on top of pretty outrageous inflation the last couple of years. So it's not deflation, it's decelerating inflation. And then the third thing I think is, we're at an inflection point just around what's the real truth around some of the technologies that we've seen over the last couple of years. I think 2024 felt like a year where we separated the wheat from the chaff a little bit on some things around generative AI and what can really add value. We started to see real differentiation between people that are winning with technology and operations and people who are just spending a lot of money and not getting a ton of value for it.
Yeah. And Dan, as you're talking about that uncertainty, it's not like we're going to be turning the corner and suddenly things will start to become more certain. So Ruth, looking back for a moment, you serve multiple clients across Europe and around the world. What was keeping your clients up at night?
From my point of view, there was in 24, obviously the topic of Gen AI and how to use it and leverage it both in products, but also for efficiency increases, which was probably in every conversation that I actually had. Secondly, with the increasing tensions in geopolitics, I think we had an uptick in the question of how to build resilient and sustainable supply chains, and maybe an evergreen, especially given the current market conditions where consumers are not so confident, was on how to improve product cost and efficiency and how to increase productivity much more general for the different companies. But in particular, obviously in Europe, which has a long history of being not as productive as, for example, the US and China. I think this will be a continued focus also for 25.
So what does that mean for leaders having to make some big decisions and maybe even investment decisions about their operations in 2025?
There's no easy answer here, but the reality is there are uncertainties for a reason. We try and encourage our clients to do and really think about is don't try and guess. Don't try and be smarter than everybody else. But what we see people really do that are, we think, doing it well is A, trying to understand what are the 3 or 4 scenarios that could play out. B, then, what are the range of outcomes for you in these different scenarios? And then C, trying to make sure you look at it holistically. And then you just got to look at it and say, hey, what are the scenarios that we think are most likely combined with what are the options whether it's a new manufacturing plant or a new procurement contract or whatever, that have the best outcomes over a wider range of scenarios.
I really don't envy anybody who needs to make a plan today. Just the last few weeks of all the announcements that we see coming from the US makes it very hard to come up with a plan. At the same time, obviously, you need to make some decisions. And I think there's a few no-regret moves. So, for example, we have this notion of having supply chains in the different regions. And I think that is something which will massively even increase. Of course, risks over the last year is a big theme. If we now add tariffs and all of those things to the mix, I think that will be increasingly a topic for all of our leaders, together with like all the implications that certain regulations have. This all leads to a push on having the supply chains no longer as global, but more local. And I think that's something where people will have to figure out a way.
You talked about productivity continuing to be the imperative, really, as organizations progress. What are some of the obvious levers for productivity that sometimes organizations might overlook?
Most successful organizations have looked at productivity every year forever. The idea of coming in with something that nobody's ever thought of before is a really high bar and probably not a realistic one. What I've seen a lot, though, is really trying to avoid the scenario where you're looking at levers that cut across the entire business. What I mean by that is I get really uncomfortable when somebody says, hey, what should I be doing on AI or machine learning? What I actually get really excited about is people say, hey, we've got an issue with planning, or we need to drive more productivity from our procurement organization. Because what you should do when you're driving procurement these days is you should do some things that you've always done. What are the strategic sourcing strategies? How are you leveraging tools like public bids, et cetera, to really drive competition? But then how are you driving digitization? How are you building the capabilities of your team to operate in this new environment, et cetera? So when people see a new technology or a new tool and they just want to point it anywhere, I get really nervous. But when we really get to the core of where are the problems or the opportunities that you see in your business, and how do we apply those solutions that are both technology, core tech, digitization, generative AI, with some more traditional things, process improvement, capability building, et cetera, that's where we're seeing people really unlock really exciting productivity improvements.
And do you already see some of those use cases being documented now? Is the playbook growing? Obviously, we saw Gen AI advance in an extortionate and very, very fast pace. And your point around scale, I think, is super important. So how many people are still just testing and piloting versus having a real playbook for a scaled application?
So it's very hard to say. We have done some comparisons in some industries. I would say everybody has been experimenting. There's probably not a single company that hasn't tried yet at all. I think it's probably a quarter or a third of the companies are really on the journey in terms of having more use cases, also knowing exactly in which areas they want to scale and which use cases first. So they have at least a plan. And if you ask about which share of the potential we have actually already captured, I think that's impossible to say, because even if you are belonging to that 1/3 who knows where they want to go, the technology is also advancing so quickly that you also have to add use cases like literally every quarter or so. And I think this journey will take us a few years down the road.
Really, the leading companies will be those companies that remain curious, that are not afraid, that are bold, and that are continuing constantly to learn and to build on their experience.
Yeah, that's a very fair summary.
And Ruth, when you're thinking about the way Dan described those productivity levers, are there any ones that are different or that you'd approach differently if you were thinking about European organizations?
I think there's one thing that we currently see also being pulled quite often, especially in Europe. Yeah, that's a footprint reallocation, both for just reaping the benefits of lower labor cost, but sometimes also because markets have changed. There's new entrants coming. They have built plants in different areas of the world. And so all of a sudden you need to also adapt to the new setting. But I think this is one of the more strategic operational topics that we have seen increasingly important over the last years.
And do you get a sense that the the approaches to building from scratch, greenfield sites, etc., as you explore your footprint, has become more efficient? Or is that still something that industry could really focus on in terms of innovation to be faster at mobilizing and achieving changes in the footprint?
I think we are actually, this is hard to say for different industries, but I think it's fairly well understood where to actually play and also how you set up production facilities in a fast way. I still see we're doing quite a lot of capital excellence work, which means exactly in those areas, reducing the cost that you associate or reducing the time to completion of some of those plans. We typically see quite some potential still there, mainly because some industries are really still immature. Yeah, if you think about the building sector as such, very often you're still waiting for things like you don't have a very good visibility on when are which parts really ready, are all the pre-parts actually on site. I think we will see a big revolution here as well in terms of transparency and also quickness of actually putting things together. But in general, I think the companies know very well how to build. Very often it's more in the subcontractor space and in all the suppliers where we see that better coordination, digital enablement can still yield quite a lot of productivity in here.
You remember, Dan, when we talked last year, one of the things you were saying is the COO should be having lunch once a week with the CIO because there's so much that they have in common and they need to join forces to really move their organizations forward. Have you seen that happening more?
Well, I was ambitious. I think when you see the COOs and CIOs, I'm not sure they're even individually eating lunch every day, given how busy and the agendas that most senior executives have these days. But in all seriousness, I do see a lot of these worlds and roles colliding and becoming much more overlapping. If you think about 5 years ago or 10 years ago, driving a planning transformation or a manufacturing transformation was purely the domain of the head of manufacturing or a COO or whatever that role was in any individual organization. And now there's no planning transformation that takes place that doesn't have a meaningful technology bent to it. In which case, the CIO not only has to have a perspective on which tool to select, not only has to have a perspective on how they're going to support it from their resources, et cetera, also has to have a perspective on how that tool or asset will kind of integrate into the broader tech stack, what is core tech versus what are the apps that sit on top of it and the capabilities. And so I just think, is planning an operations function or a technology function these days? The answer is yes. So where we see people really thrive, to take the positive bent to it, is where those different parts of the organization have melded minds around what it's going to take. And they really are each bringing their each individual expertise to make the answer better.
Yeah. And that really is right across the organization. So kind of breaking down silos right across. That's collaborating with the CFO, bringing them on board, the CHRO, the CMO, and then risk leaders as well.
Certainly, a lot of companies still have a long way to go with what we'll call functional excellence. Nobody's perfect, and that will continue to evolve. But certainly, if you look at some of the places where we're seeing the most exciting value, it's at intersections. From a productivity perspective, how are people using design to value or growth by design or whatever you want to see, which is really an intersection across innovation, product development, sourcing, manufacturing, et cetera, to really get the right design and specs of the product. When you look at planning and understanding the resiliency that you need in your supply chain and driving stuff every day, it's from procurement all the way to manufacturing and logistics into the commercial function and really into finance in terms of how we're planning our investments. So I could keep going, but so many of the things that we do today are really cross-functional. And the reality is the technology in a way makes it much easier to do that. But in some ways, the technology also makes it harder to do that, because if you don't understand how the technology is ingesting data, how they're using that data, and how they're giving you the information to make decisions, sometimes it's easier for people to see that when it's in a spreadsheet or they've had to do it manually. And so the technology is a massive enabler. It also, in some places, is a real hurdle for people getting the buy-in and mindset that they need to have to kind of drive performance going forward in some of these cross-functional endeavors.
Thinking across function is anyway something that has in many companies not been a strength, as it requires you to really collaborate well and also to reach out to other colleagues in other departments. So we see that especially in the field of supply chain, where you need to collaborate from sales to purchasing to logistics and to the plant logistics in the end. And that was historically very difficult. So you would have like a sales planning, and then you would translate it into whatever else until it ends up in manufacturing. And I think that some very successful companies are currently really integrating the whole view into a better planning mechanism that allows you to also reduce working capital, cash you need, and it just gives you also, again, a better customer experience because your time to market is much faster. So I think absolutely, as you say, cross collaboration is very much needed. And in terms of the operating model, I think that's also a very, very important topic, because if you think about Gen AI giving you the potential to reduce the amount of time that you need for any given task, that doesn't mean that you can necessarily get 50, 60, 70% out of all of the tasks. So you have a very differentiated view on where you can pull which levers, which means you have to redesign your organizational model, as in some areas you are able to get rid of 50% of the tasks, while in other it's only 10. So, and creating this new view of how we work together, leveraging technology in a much better way, is an ongoing source of change, I believe.
Yeah. And actually getting buy-in and getting leadership to commit to big investment decisions is becoming harder and harder. I'm getting a sense. Certainly when we were talking to CIOs recently at a conference, many of them were saying, how do I build the business case now for the next level of investment? And what would your advice be there, Dan?
Well, it's kind of funny when people often go to build business cases, the powers that be that are approving said business cases talk about, let's build in this flexibility. We need to understand the resilience. And then the number comes back and it's too big. And it's like, okay, well, what gets stripped out a lot of times is all that resilience and all that flexibility. So you get one complexity there. The second complexity you have is, look, I think a lot of CFOs and CEOs are a bit scarred by some technology investments that have been made in the past. I think CIOs and CFOs and CEOs, there's a lot more scrutiny around what are the benefits that we're going to see. And not just are those benefits going to be there, but can we actually capture those benefits? I was at a client recently and the conversation is massive SG&A improvement from a technology, which is absolutely true, but it comes from 10 or 20% of hundreds and thousands of people versus 100% of people. And so how do you actually think about monetizing that? One of the things that we're seeing is trying people to get much more sharp on being very thoughtful and exhaustive in terms of what goes into the investments. I think there's nothing more frustrating for people than feeling like you have to come back to the well in terms of investments. And the second thing is just being really clear, not just where on the value can be created, but how do you make sure you can take that value out and really see it on the bottom line? Right? In this SG&A example, it wasn't necessarily about taking jobs out. It was actually, how are we going to repurpose that to something that's productive versus having it just be lost into the system? And so I think that notion of not just what is the benefit, digitizing part of somebody's job or doing this, but how does that benefit actually going to see its way through to the P&L, where a CEO, CFO, COO, everybody can actually see it, taste it, touch it, and feel good about that when they're looking at it down the road.
I suppose it's not just about the leadership and the folks who are making the budget decisions, but it's also about the people who need to make the transformation work. How can you continue to bring those folks along with you and the role of the worker on the front line to make the transformation happen? It continues to be a big challenge.
It's a big challenge, and almost all of our research suggests that when you have transformations that go awry, whether it's a technology-based transformation or not, at the core of it is the motivations, capabilities, and mindsets of the body of the church. And so that's been a truism for a long time with transformation work. It's, in our opinion, getting even more acute when it's technology-based transformation. The number of times you go to a client and say, we actually have this tool, but our adoption is low, or people aren't using it, or they're pulling the data out of the tool and manipulating it within their spreadsheets, et cetera. And to be fair, I think a lot of companies are getting a lot wiser and a lot more sophisticated in terms of how they think about this.
And Ruth, I know the topic of sustainability is super close to your heart. In fact, you had a leadership role in sustainability and ops for a number of years. Where do you think that is going when we think about operations productivity? And I suppose the other exciting development is how we're seeing dual mission initiatives. So where changes are made to go for productivity and efficiency, actually what we're also seeing is then decarbonization benefits in big operations and heavy industry type of processes that are being changed and transformed.
From my point of view, in many instances, there is not even a conflict between the two. For example, if you're talking production, obviously energy costs are very often a driver also of production effectiveness. And if you are able to optimize the process for higher energy efficiency, which is one of the things that we are typically doing, then energy consumption goes down, and then obviously also CO2 emission goes down. And very often that is the case. You have one idea and it serves both purposes. And then obviously sometimes if you need to exchange some processes in order to be more sustainable, that can also increase costs. So for example, if you today want to get completely natural gas free and use hydrogen for this, hydrogen today is still much more expensive, then it comes to a point where you really need to make a trade-off, how important sustainability is for you. But I think in probably 60-70% of the cases, it actually goes together in line, and ideas also benefit the environment.
And Ruth, what would you say are one or two things that our listeners should be thinking about as they decide on their path forward?
Number one is probably never stop being curious about new technologies. And number two is you better get going at productivity increases now because there's so much competition coming and you need to be prepared.
And Dan, what are the two things that leaders should be taking away with them and thinking about as they shape their plans for 2025 and beyond?
I would say one is set a really high aspiration for what you can achieve from a productivity and tech enabling your operations perspective. There's more people that are successful hitting really big aspirations oftentimes than there are the people that are successful hitting smaller aspirations, because with some of this technology enablement, with some of the end-to-end cross-functional things, it takes a mindset that we've got to be disruptive versus we've just got to be a little bit better. And so I think that's one. And the second I would have is really invest in your people and the capabilities. Jobs that have changed and are changing so much. And the people, the companies and the organizations and the individuals that have talent around them that are both understanding of the way things used to be, in quotes, but also equipped to be successful in this brave new world that we're in, and it's just going to accelerate from here. I think you'll really be able to tell the difference in terms of performance going forward. So I guess at the most basic level, set a really big aspiration in terms of what you can achieve from a productivity and an impact perspective, and invest in your people.
Love it. And Dan, what is there to be optimistic about when it comes to the operations agenda next year?
Well, I self-proclaimed am a glass half full kind of person, so I have a lot I'm optimistic about. But if you force me in to say one thing in particular, I am optimistic that we have or are reaching the tipping point on people really getting a lot of value from the tech-enabled operations investments that they're making. Now, it comes with doing it the right way, like we talked about, focusing on the people, building capabilities, et cetera. But I'm really optimistic that we're turning a corner and people are going to see a lot of benefit and a lot of value from doing the right technology investments in the right way in their operations.
And Ruth, what are you most optimistic about for operations in 2025?
I think the potential that some of those new technologies actually deliver to us, which we have not been able to actually look at in the last decades, is enormous. And so for an operations person, it's always great to be able to take a step change in cost out or in time to market or whatever improvement lever it actually is. And this is enabled by the new digital tools that we are having. And so I think for an operations person, it's super exciting to start leveraging all of this.
And that comes back to your point about curiosity. Do not stop being curious. But you're optimistic that some of these solutions are really around the corner.
No, they're there, yeah. Starting with like a digital twin for supply chain or all the things that we discussed earlier on scheduling optimization. These are things that have not been possible a few years ago, which means that if you are now getting a target which is almost impossible to meet, you can also be very optimistic about the potential that you can actually get at with all of the new things that you have at your hand.
Thank you both. I love the way that we're ending on a positive note.
Terrific. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to McKinsey Talks Operations with me, Daphne Luchtenberg. If you like what you heard, subscribe and stay tuned. Another great episode starts now.